In less than a decade, Zimbabwe experienced one of the most extreme economic collapses in modern history. The annual inflation rate soared to an unimaginable 79.6 billion%, with prices doubling every day. Unemployment reached around 94%, and life expectancy dropped by over 20 years. The Zimbabwean dollar became so worthless that entire life savings could barely buy a loaf of bread. This crisis shattered the economy and left millions struggling to survive, with professionals forced into street vending and basic goods slipping out of reach. But behind these mind-boggling numbers, how did everyday Zimbabweans cope? The reality of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis came into sharp focus as the Zimbabwean dollar's value plummeted. In daily life, this meant that money itself became unreliable. Prices didn't just rise, they changed constantly, sometimes even within the same day. Shoppers could walk into a bakery in the morning, only to find that by evening, the price of a loaf of bread had doubled or tripled. Shopkeepers struggled to update prices fast enough, often resorting to handwritten signs or verbal updates as the day wore on. People carried bags and even wheelbarrows full of notes, not because they were wealthy, but because that was what it took to buy the most basic goods. Hyperinflation, in technical terms, is when prices increase at an extremely rapid rate and the currency's purchasing power erodes almost overnight. In Zimbabwe, this process accelerated to a point rarely seen in history. Annual inflation exceeded 79.6 billion% by mid-2008. The Zimbabwean dollar lost value so quickly that small denominations became useless. People tossed aside notes that, only months before, would have covered daily expenses. The act of counting money itself became absurd. There was simply too much of it, and it was worth too little. Banknotes became the most visible sign of the crisis. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe issued notes in ever larger denominations. First millions, then billions, and eventually the now infamous $100 trillion bill. To put that in perspective, this note could barely buy a week's groceries by the time it was in circulation. The $100 trillion bill became an international curiosity, but for Zimbabweans, it was a daily reminder that the currency, and the system behind it, was collapsing. Some people even wrote out the zeros by hand, turning the notes into a kind of protest art that underscored the absurdity of the situation. These massive bills had another strange feature: expiration dates. Some notes were valid only for a few months, with phrases like "valid until December 31st, 2008, printed right on them. By the time new bills reached the public, their value had already been eroded by runaway inflation. Money became a perishable item, and people had to spend it as soon as they received it. Waiting even a few hours could mean losing half its value. The psychological toll was enormous. Savings evaporated, and the concept of planning for the future became meaningless. This wasn't just an economic abstraction, it was a daily struggle. The government's response to mounting deficits was to print more money, hoping to cover expenses and keep the economy afloat. But with every new batch of notes, the problem only grew. More money in circulation chased fewer goods, driving prices ever higher. Inflation, which in most economies is measured in single or double digits annually, became a daily event. People rushed to spend their salaries the moment they were paid, knowing that by the next day, their wages might only buy a fraction of what they needed. As the Zimbabwean dollar lost credibility, people were forced to adapt. Barter networks sprang up, allowing people to trade goods and services directly. A bag of maize might be exchanged for a few liters of cooking oil, or a mechanic might fix a bicycle in return for a sack of potatoes. For many, this was the only way to meet basic needs. At the same time, foreign currencies, especially the US dollar and South African rand, became the de facto mediums of exchange. Shops began posting prices in dollars, and those who had access to foreign currency were able to shield themselves, at least partially, from the chaos. But not everyone had access to dollars or rand. The gap between those with foreign currency and those without widened. Conversion rates were often arbitrary, and the black market thrived as people scrambled to exchange whatever they had for something more stable. Even gold dust was used in some transactions, weighed out in small amounts to pay for daily essentials. The entire economy became a patchwork of barter, foreign cash, and whatever else people could use to get by. The collapse of trust in the Zimbabwean dollar was complete. Money only works because people believe it holds value. Once that belief is gone, the entire system unravels. In Zimbabwe, this breakdown was total. People stopped asking how much things cost in local currency. Instead, transactions became negotiations. What do you have, and what will you accept in return? Banks, already struggling, froze accounts and restricted withdrawals. For many, accessing their own money became impossible, and savings built up over a lifetime vanished in a matter of months. This forced everyone to make hard choices. Farmers who once sold their crops for cash began demanding goods in return: fuel, tools, or even clothing. Families sold off possessions, from furniture to heirlooms, just to afford food. Others left the country altogether, joining a growing wave of economic migrants searching for stability elsewhere. The exodus drained Zimbabwe of skilled workers and left families divided. But for many, it was the only way to survive. Hyperinflation's impact went far beyond economics. It reached into every part of daily life. The emotional toll was profound. Parents watching their children go hungry, pensioners seeing their life savings turn to dust, and entire communities losing faith in the future. The relentless uncertainty made it impossible to plan, to save, or to hope for improvement. Yet, despite the hardship, people adapted. They learned to navigate the new reality, relying on barter, foreign currency, and whatever ingenuity they could muster. Shops and businesses faced their own set of challenges. With prices changing multiple times a day, it became nearly impossible to keep up. Some stores stopped updating price tags altogether, simply quoting prices verbally or refusing to accept Zimbabwean dollars. Others closed their doors, unable to restock shelves or pay suppliers as the value of money collapsed. The result was a landscape where even if you had stacks of cash, finding basic goods was another matter entirely. As the crisis deepened, entire communities leaned on informal networks to survive. Barter became not just a way to trade, but a way to build trust and maintain relationships. People shared what little they had, pooled resources, and looked out for neighbors. In some cases, local leaders organized communal buying groups or set up small exchange markets to help people access essentials. These grassroots efforts provided a fragile safety net when formal systems failed. The story of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is not just about economics. It's about the daily reality of living with a currency that no longer works. The numbers are staggering, but the real impact is measured in lives disrupted, dreams deferred, and communities reshaped by necessity. The ways people adapted, through barter, foreign currency, and community support, offer a glimpse of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, as money lost its power, another crisis emerged. The shops and markets that once bustled with activity began to empty out. Shelves were bare, not because people stopped shopping, but because there was simply nothing left to buy. Supermarkets that had once been filled with essentials became stark reminders of economic collapse. Wide aisles echoed with emptiness, and the few items that remained were often priced far beyond what most could afford. The breakdown of supply chains meant that even with stacks of money, people found themselves unable to secure basic necessities. It wasn't just a matter of inflation making goods expensive. Goods themselves had vanished from the formal market. leaving families to navigate an uncertain and often desperate daily existence. Hyperinflation didn't simply erode the value of money. It disrupted every step of the process that brought goods from producers to consumers. Businesses faced a landscape where costs changed so quickly that pricing became guesswork. The price of flour, fuel, or labor could shift dramatically in just a few hours. For shop owners, this made restocking nearly impossible. If they raised prices to keep up with costs, they risked losing customers. If they didn't, inflation would wipe out their profits before they could replace their inventory. Many businesses simply shut their doors, unable to operate in such chaos. The government's response made things even more complicated. In an attempt to curb runaway prices, officials imposed strict price controls, forcing shops to sell goods at rates far below their actual cost. Soldiers were deployed to enforce these measures, standing guard in stores and ensuring compliance. Instead of stabilizing the market, these controls drove goods off the shelves and out of the formal economy entirely. Shop owners, faced with the threat of financial ruin, moved their stock to the black market, where they could charge prices that reflected reality. The result was a sharp divide. The official economy, where goods were scarce and stores were shuttered, and the black market, where essentials could sometimes be found at a steep price. As formal supply chains collapsed, black markets and informal networks became the main sources of survival for many Zimbabweans. Goods like cooking oil, maize meal, soap, and medicine, once reliably available in stores, now changed hands in back alleys and roadside stalls. Transactions were often conducted in foreign currencies such as the US dollar or South African rand, which held their value far better than the Zimbabwean dollar. For those without access to foreign cash, bartering became a lifeline. People traded what little they had, perhaps a chicken for a bag of maize or a few hours of labor for a bottle of cooking oil. These exchanges were rarely ideal, but they were necessary in a system where traditional money no longer served its purpose. Bread, a staple food, became a symbol of the crisis. Its price didn't just rise. It soared into the millions, then billions, of Zimbabwean dollars. Even when people managed to scrape together enough cash, they were often met with empty shelves. For rural families, the situation was even more dire. The collapse of transportation networks meant that deliveries rarely reached outlying areas, leaving entire communities isolated from what little supply remained. Urban dwellers lined up for hours outside stores, hoping for a delivery that might never come. The few who managed to buy essentials often did so at prices that devoured their entire week's wages. The informal economy grew in size and importance. Street markets and cross-border trading networks sprang up almost overnight. Goods smuggled in from neighboring countries like South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia became lifelines for many families. These operations were risky, involving bribes to border officials and the constant threat of confiscation. Yet, for many Zimbabweans, these networks were the only way to access food, fuel, and medicine. Price controls and government crackdowns only increased the risks. Soldiers patrolled markets and shops, searching for evidence of illegal trading or hoarding. Vendors faced arrest or the loss of their goods if caught selling above the official price. Despite these dangers, the black market thrived, driven by necessity. People adapted quickly, learning to navigate a world where every transaction carried risk but was essential for survival. For those without access to black market goods or foreign currency, survival meant making hard choices. Families rationed food, skipped meals, and went without medicine. chronic illnesses became life-threatening as pharmacies ran out of basic supplies. Hospitals, already under strain, struggled to function without reliable access to medicines and equipment. The health crisis deepened as malnutrition and preventable diseases took hold. The social fabric of communities began to fray. The constant search for essentials consumed daily life, sometimes fostering cooperation, but just as often leading to conflict. Neighbors shared what little they had, but tensions flared when rumors spread about new deliveries or hidden stockpiles. Fights broke out over the last bag of flour, and crowds gathered in hopes of securing a place in line if word got out that a delivery truck was on its way. Survival became a daily negotiation, not just with shopkeepers or vendors, but with other desperate families. In the midst of these shortages, some resorted to extreme measures. One particularly striking story emerged in 2003 during a period of acute fuel shortages. A mortician began renting out corpses so people could claim extra fuel rations, which were otherwise unattainable through legal means. This chilling arrangement was not just a symptom of a broken economy, but a reflection of how the crisis had forced people to abandon conventional boundaries in their pursuit of survival. Businesses that remained open faced mounting losses. Suppliers refused to sell raw materials at government-mandated prices, making it impossible to restock. Store owners faced the constant threat of closure or prosecution if they were caught violating price controls. Many simply locked their doors for good, unwilling to risk further losses or legal trouble. The deployment of soldiers to enforce economic policy did little to restore confidence. Instead, it deepened mistrust and accelerated the shift of goods and commerce into informal channels. Despite these immense challenges, Zimbabweans continued to adapt. Families pooled resources to send relatives across borders, returning with precious supplies for entire communities. Street vendors found ways to source goods from informal contacts, keeping small pockets of commerce alive. In many cases, these efforts were the only thing standing between families and hunger. The informal economy was not a solution, but it was a testament to human resourcefulness. People learned to survive in a world where the institutions they once relied on, banks, shops, and government offices, could no longer meet even the most basic needs. Empty supermarkets were more than a sign of economic failure. They were a daily reminder that the social contract had broken down. As the crisis deepened, its effects spread beyond the most vulnerable. Middle-class professionals, once secure in their careers, found themselves facing the same shortages and uncertainties. The collapse of the formal economy meant that even those with education and skills were forced to confront a new reality. The next challenge was not just about finding food or medicine, but about redefining what it meant to work, to earn a living, and to maintain dignity in the face of relentless hardship. For many of Zimbabwe's professionals, the collapse of the formal economy meant a complete upheaval of daily life. Doctors, teachers, and engineers, people who had dedicated years to education and training, found themselves forced into entirely new roles just to survive. Some set up roadside stalls, selling vegetables or small goods sourced from neighboring countries. Teachers who once led classrooms now negotiated prices for cooking oil, and engineers who managed complex projects became informal traders, hawking whatever they could obtain. The shift was not just about income. It was about adapting to a reality where skills and qualifications no longer guaranteed even the most basic standard of living. Hyperinflation quickly rendered salaries meaningless. For professionals who had built their lives around predictable paychecks, the impact was immediate and devastating. A nurse or teacher might receive a month's wage only to find it was worth less than a day's bus fare by the time it was paid out. The erosion of income was relentless, stripping away the security and respect that came with their professions. The social contract between education, work, and reward broke down. A vendor with a steady supply of tomatoes or soap could suddenly earn more than a doctor or engineer. In this new order, expertise and experience had little value compared to the ability to access goods for trade. As the currency lost its function, the workforce transformed. Many skilled workers shifted to informal trading, setting up stalls in busy markets or by the roadside. These new roles were often a temporary measure, a way to put food on the table while searching for more stable solutions. Others turned to cross-border trading, traveling to South Africa, Botswana, or Zambia to purchase goods they could resell at home. This informal economy grew rapidly, filling the void left by the collapse of formal employment, but it also highlighted the depth of the crisis. The link between professional training and economic reward had been severed. Not everyone could adapt to the new landscape. For some, the only viable choice was to leave Zimbabwe in search of stability. This mass emigration, known as the brain drain, saw millions of skilled workers, doctors, teachers, engineers, and technicians, depart for neighboring countries and beyond. Estimates suggest that as much as 30% of Zimbabwe's population left during the worst years of hyperinflation. Hospitals and schools lost most of their experienced staff almost overnight. The impact was immediate and severe. Clinics struggled to operate with only a handful of doctors, and classrooms were left without qualified teachers. Those who remained often faced overwhelming workloads and a lack of resources, making their jobs nearly impossible. The consequences of this exodus rippled through every sector. In healthcare, critical shortages of medical staff meant that many clinics could no longer offer even basic services. Patients sometimes arrived at hospitals to find there were no doctors available, or that the remaining staff had no medicines to dispense. In education, the loss of teachers left entire schools unable to function. Rural areas were hit especially hard, but even urban centers struggled to maintain standards. Parents who could afford it looked for alternatives, sometimes sending their children abroad for schooling. The absence of skilled professionals also stalled progress in agriculture, construction, and telecommunications. Projects were abandoned, and infrastructure deteriorated as engineers and technicians left for better opportunities elsewhere. The long-term effects of the brain drain were profound. Rebuilding essential services requires experience and institutional knowledge, resources that became increasingly scarce as the crisis wore on. Training new doctors, engineers, or teachers is a process that takes years, and even with the will to rebuild, Zimbabwe lacked the means. The gap left by those who emigrated was not easily filled, and the loss of expertise slowed recovery efforts across the board. For a generation of Zimbabweans, the quality of healthcare, education, and public services declined sharply, with consequences that would last for decades. For those who stayed, survival demanded constant adaptation. The informal economy became the backbone of daily life. Street corners and markets filled with professionals selling a patchwork of goods, anything that could be sourced, bartered, or resold. Teachers offered private lessons from their homes, sometimes accepting payment in food or fuel instead of cash. Doctors provided consultations in exchange for foreign currency or basic necessities. These arrangements were fragile, subject to the uncertainties of supply and the ever-changing value of money. Yet, they became crucial for families trying to navigate the turmoil. Remittances from the diaspora emerged as a vital lifeline. Money sent home by those who had emigrated helped support families left behind. fueling an informal economy that operated alongside the broken official system. These funds allowed relatives to buy essentials and pay for services, softening the blow of hyperinflation for some. While remittances could not replace functioning public institutions or restore lost careers, they provided a measure of stability for countless households. This period also demanded emotional resilience. For professionals forced to abandon their careers, the transition was not just an economic setback, but a personal loss. The work that once defined them, saving lives, teaching children, building infrastructure, became impossible or irrelevant in the face of daily survival. Many struggled to reconcile their new roles with the identities they had built over years of study and dedication. The frustration and disappointment were palpable, but so was the determination to keep going, even if it meant starting over in a roadside stall or a crowded foreign city. Communities responded by strengthening informal networks. Families pooled resources, sometimes sending a single member abroad to work and send money home. Neighbors shared information about where to find scarce goods or which markets had the best prices. Informal trade became not just a way to earn a living, but a means of mutual support. In the absence of reliable banks, stable salaries, or trustworthy institutions, these connections offered a fragile sense of security. The shift from professional careers to informal trading and emigration reshaped Zimbabwe's society. The loss of skilled workers made it harder for the country to recover, and the breakdown of traditional employment patterns left many uncertain about the future. Yet, the adaptability and resourcefulness shown by individuals and communities revealed a deep capacity for endurance. People found ways to survive, even as the systems they once relied on collapsed around them. This transformation of daily life set the stage for new challenges. As salaries became meaningless and jobs disappeared, banks, long seen as pillars of stability, began to falter as well. What happens when you can no longer trust your money, and even your savings are trapped behind closed doors? For Zimbabweans, the next hurdle was not just earning a living, but finding ways to access and use whatever resources they had left. Banking in Zimbabwe once meant security, a place to store hard-earned money and plan for the future. But as hyperinflation took hold, these institutions became nearly unusable. Withdrawal limits were set so low that ATMs dispensed as little as $1 or $2 worth of local currency per day, barely enough for bus fare, let alone groceries. People lined up outside banks for hours, hoping to access their funds, but often left empty-handed. The frustration grew as savings lost value by the hour, and the cash that was finally withdrawn could buy less and less. For many, the act of going to the bank became a daily ordeal with little reward. Strict withdrawal policies were meant to stem the chaos, but they only deepened it. Even when people managed to reach the front of the line, there was no guarantee that any cash remained. The government's attempt to control the outflow of money by rationing withdrawals did nothing to address the root problem. The currency itself was collapsing. As the Zimbabwean dollar's value evaporated, pensions and salaries became meaningless. A lifetime of saving could be reduced to the equivalent of a loaf of bread. And payday was less about what was earned and more about how quickly it could be spent before inflation rendered it useless. In this environment, Zimbabweans turned to whatever means they could to maintain some sense of normalcy. Bartering quickly became a necessity. People exchanged goods and services directly. Perhaps a mechanic would fix a bicycle in return for a sack of maize or a few liters of cooking oil. Markets adapted to these new realities as well. Portable gold scales appeared on tables, allowing people to weigh gold dust for small transactions. This innovation made it possible to assign value to goods when money failed, and gold dust, despite its inconveniences, held its worth in a way the local currency no longer could. Foreign currencies became another vital workaround. The US dollar and South African rand emerged as preferred mediums of exchange, offering stability and predictability. Market vendors and shopkeepers began to price goods exclusively in foreign currencies, bypassing the Zimbabwean dollar altogether. Even a single US dollar bill could purchase far more than a pile of local notes. However, access to foreign cash was uneven. Those with relatives abroad or connections to cross-border traders were better positioned, while many others had to resort to the black market, where rates were unpredictable and risks high. This shift created new divides in society, as access to stable currency determined who could afford essentials and who could not. The adoption of gold dust as a form of payment was especially common in rural areas, where access to foreign currency was limited. Small containers of gold dust became a practical alternative to cash, and portable scales allowed precise measurements for everyday purchases. This system, while cumbersome, gave people a way to transact when neither local currency nor bank withdrawals could meet their needs. Still, it required trust between buyers and sellers, and not everyone had gold to trade, making the system far from universal. As the formal financial system continued to break down, Zimbabweans found new ways to adapt. One of the most significant innovations was the rise of mobile money platforms, particularly EcoCash. These services allowed users to send and receive money via mobile phones, bypassing the need for physical cash. By 2017, digital payments made up 90% of all transactions in Zimbabwe, effectively turning the economy nearly cashless. People could pay for groceries, school fees, and even utility bills with a few taps on their phones. For many, mobile money became a lifeline, offering a degree of financial stability and convenience that traditional banks could no longer provide. However, mobile money was not a perfect solution. It required access to a mobile phone, a reliable network, and a basic level of digital literacy, barriers that excluded some of the most vulnerable. In rural and marginalized communities, unreliable electricity and limited infrastructure made digital transactions difficult. Even in urban areas, network outages and technical glitches sometimes left people unable to access their funds. Despite these challenges, the widespread adoption of mobile payments helped many Zimbabweans navigate the worst of the cash shortages and continue participating in economic life. Throughout this period, the government's attempts to manage the crisis often worsened public confidence. Printing more money to cover deficits only fueled inflation, and bank withdrawal limits did little to restore trust. People watched as their savings evaporated, and the institutions they once relied on became symbols of economic failure. The experience left a lasting mark. Even after hyperinflation eventually eased, many Zimbabweans continued to avoid banks, preferring to keep assets in physical goods, foreign currency, or mobile accounts. The collapse of the banking system had far-reaching effects on daily life. Without reliable access to cash or savings, people had to improvise constantly. Some bartered with neighbors, while others relied on remittances from family members working abroad. Informal networks grew stronger as communities pooled resources and shared information about where to find goods, or which vendors accepted alternative forms of payment. These coping strategies showcase the resilience and adaptability of Zimbabweans in the face of extraordinary hardship. Yet, these adaptations were ultimately stopgaps. Barter worked only when both parties had something the other needed. Gold dust and foreign currency helped, but were not evenly distributed. Mobile money provided a digital workaround, but not everyone could participate. The informal economy that emerged was creative and resourceful, but it could not replace the efficiency or stability of a functioning financial system. The underlying problem, the destruction of trust in banks and currency, remained unresolved. The legacy of this period is visible in the way people continue to approach money and banking today. Skepticism toward financial institutions persists, and many prefer to keep their wealth outside the formal system. The trauma of lost savings and inaccessible funds has reshaped attitudes toward risk, planning, and investment. For Zimbabweans, the memory of standing in line for hours, only to withdraw a handful of nearly worthless bills, is not easily forgotten. But this breakdown in the banking system was not an accident. It was the result of a series of policy decisions that undermined the foundations of the economy. While hyperinflation and money printing played a major role, another government action set the stage for the collapse of trust in banks and currency. Before the printing presses unleashed a flood of worthless notes, a sweeping land reform policy upended the country's agricultural sector, disrupting the economic backbone that had supported Zimbabwe for decades. Understanding how this earlier decision triggered such widespread instability is key to grasping the roots of the crisis that followed. In 2000, Zimbabwe's government launched the fast-track land reform program under President Robert Mugabe. The stated aim was to address long-standing imbalances in land ownership, a legacy of colonial rule. While a small white minority controlled most of the country's fertile land, the majority of black Zimbabweans had limited access to productive farmland. The government argued that redistributing land would correct these historical injustices and empower millions who had been excluded from the country's agricultural wealth. But the way this policy was carried out would have dramatic and lasting consequences for the entire nation. Earlier attempts at land redistribution had moved slowly. During the 1980s and 1990s, the government relied on a willing seller, willing buyer approach, purchasing land from white farmers to resettle black Zimbabweans. However, progress lagged because the government lacked the funding to buy land on the scale needed to make a significant difference. Frustration grew among landless citizens and political pressure mounted as Mugabe's popularity began to wane, especially with the rise of the opposition movement for democratic change. In this tense environment, the government abandoned gradual reforms and turned to a radical solution. The impact on agricultural output was immediate and severe. Before the reforms, Zimbabwe's commercial farms produced the bulk of the nation's maize, wheat, and tobacco, crops essential for both domestic consumption and export. Within just 3 years, maize production dropped by 66%, wheat by 91%, and tobacco by 75%. These numbers were not just statistics. They represented a collapse of the country's food security and its main sources of foreign currency. Food shortages became commonplace, and prices for basic staples soared. Zimbabwe, once known as the breadbasket of southern Africa, found itself unable to feed its own population. This sharp decline in production affected more than just the availability of food. The agricultural sector had formed the backbone of Zimbabwe's economy, supporting related industries such as fertilizer suppliers, transport companies, and food processors. When commercial farming collapsed, these sectors suffered as well. The expertise and infrastructure that had made large-scale production possible were lost almost overnight. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair, machinery was abandoned, and supply chains broke down. New landholders, often lacking both resources and knowledge, struggled to maintain even minimal levels of output. The government provided little support to bridge this gap, and the situation quickly deteriorated. The political motivations behind the reform shaped its outcomes. Mugabe used the land seizures to reinforce his political base, framing the program as a long overdue act of justice against the white minority. However, the reality was more complex. While some ordinary Zimbabweans did receive land, the majority of high-value farms were handed to individuals with ties to the ruling party. Many of these recipients used the land for personal gain rather than agricultural production. Farmhouses became private residences or retreats, and productive land was left idle. The people who had worked these farms, an estimated 300,000 black farm workers, were left without jobs, homes, or support. The violence and instability of the land reform program had far-reaching consequences. The exodus of experienced white farmers was accompanied by a broader flight of capital and expertise. Investors lost confidence in the government's respect for property rights and withdrew support. International donors, who had funded rural development and food security programs, suspended aid in protest against the chaotic and often violent seizures. This loss of external support further weakened the agricultural sector and deepened the crisis. As food production collapsed, hunger spread rapidly. At the height of the crisis, nearly half of Zimbabwe's population faced food insecurity. Aid organizations attempted to step in, but the distribution of food aid was often politicized. Access to relief depended on loyalty to the government, and in some cases, bribes were required to secure assistance. This manipulation of aid deepened social divisions and left many vulnerable families without help. The government's efforts to suppress information about the scale of the disaster made it difficult for the outside world to grasp the full extent of the crisis. The agricultural collapse also triggered a broader economic crisis. Without export crops like tobacco, Zimbabwe lost a major source of foreign currency. This made it increasingly difficult to pay for imports, including fuel, medicine, and other essentials. The shortage of foreign exchange put intense pressure on the government's finances and contributed to shortages throughout the economy. As revenues from agriculture dried up, the government faced mounting deficits and dwindling reserves. The effects rippled through every part of Zimbabwean society. Businesses that depended on agricultural output closed or downsized. Unemployment soared. Rural communities that had relied on commercial farms for income and services were left destitute. The breakdown of supply chains meant that even urban residents, far from the fields, felt the impact of food shortages and rising prices. The sense of instability eroded trust in government institutions and made recovery even more difficult. For ordinary Zimbabweans, the consequences were immediate and harsh. Families that had once been self-sufficient found themselves dependent on food aid or forced to migrate in search of work. The loss of jobs in agriculture and related industries pushed millions into poverty. The collapse of the agricultural sector also weakened the country's ability to respond to other crises, from disease outbreaks to natural disasters. Politically, the land reform program achieved its short-term goal of consolidating support for Mugabe and the ruling party. However, the long-term costs were enormous. The destruction of commercial agriculture undermined the foundations of the economy and set off a chain reaction of shortages, unemployment, and social unrest. The government's reliance on patronage and political loyalty over practical experience meant that productive land was often left idle, and the skills needed to rebuild the sector were lost. The loss of export earnings and foreign currency reserves left the government with few options. As revenues fell and the economy contracted, officials looked for ways to finance growing deficits and maintain basic services. With traditional sources of income gone, the government turned to printing money as a last resort. This decision would have profound consequences for the value of the currency and the stability of the entire financial system. The collapse of Zimbabwe's agricultural sector was not just a story of mismanagement. It was a turning point that pushed the country into deeper economic crisis. The loss of foreign currency from exports made it nearly impossible to pay for critical imports or meet government obligations. Faced with mounting debt and a shrinking economy, the government's next move was to print more money, a response that would only accelerate Zimbabwe's downward spiral. As Zimbabwe's economic foundation crumbled, government leaders turned to the one lever still within their immediate control: the printing press. Printing money became the centerpiece of their strategy to address mounting fiscal pressures. This was not an abstract policy choice. It was a direct response to a widening gap between government obligations and available resources. The collapse in agricultural exports slashed foreign currency earnings, while the state's spending commitments only grew. One of the most significant drains was the military intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which by 1998 had cost Zimbabwe an estimated $6 billion. This, combined with obligations to pay civil servants and fund patronage networks, left the government desperate for cash. With foreign reserves rapidly depleted, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe began issuing new currency at an unprecedented rate. The hope was that this influx of cash would keep the government afloat and allow it to meet its payroll and other pressing expenses. But there was no corresponding growth in goods or services to match the new supply of money. Instead, the economy was shrinking, production was down, and confidence in the country's financial system was eroding. The result was a textbook case of inflation spiraling out of control. The mechanics were straightforward. As more money chased fewer goods, prices began to rise at an alarming pace. This was not a gradual process. Each round of new currency entering circulation only accelerated the loss of value. The government's response to rising prices was to print even more money, further fueling the cycle. In the absence of any economic growth, unchecked increases in the money supply led directly to runaway inflation. By the mid-2000s, Zimbabwe's inflation rate was among the highest ever recorded, with prices sometimes doubling within hours. The Reserve Bank tried to keep up with this reality by issuing ever larger denominations. What began with million-dollar notes quickly escalated to billions, then trillions. The $100 trillion note became a symbol of the crisis, not because of its purchasing power, but because of its absurdity. By the time these notes reached the public, their value had already been eroded by the relentless pace of inflation. People would receive stacks of new bills, only to find that they could barely afford a few basic items, if those items were even available in stores. To cope with currency shortages and the logistical challenges of printing so many notes, the government also introduced bearer checks. These were essentially temporary banknotes, issued in high denominations and often stamped with expiration dates. Some of these checks expired just months after being issued, underlining the chaos of the monetary system. Imagine being paid in notes that you had to spend almost immediately, or risk losing everything. This only deepened the sense of instability and confusion in daily life. The psychological toll was immense. For a currency to function, people must believe in its value. In Zimbabwe, that belief was shattered by the government's relentless money printing and the visible collapse of the banking system. The erosion of trust was not instantaneous, but it gathered momentum with every failed transaction and every new banknote that lost value before it could be spent. People stopped thinking in terms of savings or future planning. Survival became the only priority. The rituals of daily life, shopping, paying bills, saving for school fees, were upended by the knowledge that money itself was unreliable. Government spending choices played a central role in this collapse. Much of the newly printed money did not go toward rebuilding the economy or supporting vulnerable citizens. Instead, it was channeled into military operations, extravagant government expenditures, and the maintenance of political patronage networks. Funds were used to reward loyalists, pay off political allies, and prop up the ruling party's machinery. These priorities did nothing to address the underlying economic problems. If anything, they made the situation worse by diverting resources away from productive investment and further undermining public trust. Attempts to stabilize the situation through redenomination, removing zeros from the currency, offered only temporary relief. These measures did nothing to change the underlying dynamics. Each round of redenomination was quickly overtaken by reality, as inflation continued to erode the value of whatever new notes were introduced. The government's inability to control spending or restore confidence in the currency left Zimbabweans trapped in a cycle of crisis. The human cost grew as wages became meaningless and unemployment soared. People with formal jobs found that their monthly salaries could not buy even a day's worth of food. Businesses closed because they could not keep up with the pace of price changes. Even those who managed to keep working were forced to spend their pay immediately, knowing that waiting even a few hours could mean losing half its value. Stories circulated of people carrying wheelbarrows full of cash to buy groceries, only to leave the money outside because it was less valuable than the wheelbarrow itself. Daily life became a series of improvisations. Barter systems re-emerged, and people traded goods and services directly when currency failed. Some relied on remittances from relatives abroad, sent in more stable foreign currencies. Others turned to gold dust or other tangible assets as a way to store value. The formal banking system, once a pillar of trust and stability, became irrelevant to most people's lives. Mobile money platforms eventually offered a partial workaround, but these solutions could not compensate for the loss of confidence in the national currency. By late 2008, Zimbabwe's annual inflation rate had soared to a staggering 79.6 billion%. This number is almost impossible to comprehend, but its effects were visible everywhere. Empty shops, shuttered businesses, and families struggling to afford even the most basic necessities. The government continued to print money, but each new batch of notes only deepened the crisis. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Printing money to pay debts and salaries led to more inflation, which in turn required even more money to keep the system running. The consequences extended far beyond economics. The collapse of the currency eroded social trust, undermined the legitimacy of government institutions, and left millions of people facing daily uncertainty. The crisis affected all levels of society, from professionals forced into informal trading to families relying on food aid. The sense of national identity and pride was shaken by the visible failure of the country's financial system. While domestic policies were the primary driver of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, external forces also played a role in shaping the crisis. As the government's reputation deteriorated and reports of human rights abuses increased, Zimbabwe found itself increasingly isolated on the world stage. International sanctions and the withdrawal of foreign investment added new layers of difficulty, cutting the country off from sources of aid and credit that might have helped stabilize the situation. These measures, intended as pressure on the government, often had unintended consequences for ordinary people. The interplay between domestic decisions and international responses would soon become even more apparent. As Zimbabwe's leaders struggled to manage the fallout from their own policies, the outside world responded with measures that further constrained the country's options. This growing isolation would shape the next phase of Zimbabwe's economic collapse, compounding the challenges faced by its people and setting the stage for even more dramatic changes to come. Sanctions, isolation, and economic collapse became deeply intertwined in Zimbabwe's story after 2000. As the government pressed ahead with its land reform program and political repression increased, Western nations responded with targeted measures. The United States passed the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZEDERA, in 2001, which effectively barred Zimbabwe from accessing loans from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, two of the most important sources of international credit for developing nations. The European Union and other Western countries implemented their own restrictions, which included asset freezes and travel bans on senior government officials and individuals linked to the ruling party. Officially, these sanctions targeted the leadership in arms trade, not consumer goods, but their broader effect was to signal to global investors and lenders that Zimbabwe was now a high-risk environment. This shift in perception had immediate and lasting consequences for the economy. Foreign direct investment, already shaken by violent land seizures and policy uncertainty, dried up almost overnight. International companies scaled back or abandoned their operations. Planned projects were shelved indefinitely. The mining and manufacturing sectors, which depended on foreign capital and expertise, struggled to maintain even basic operations. The mere presence of sanctions, even when they did not directly block trade in most goods, amplified fears about Zimbabwe's stability, driving away both private investors and potential trading partners. At the same time, Zimbabwe's access to international credit was sharply curtailed. With ZEDERA in effect and relationships with the IMF and World Bank severed, the government lost critical avenues for borrowing. This made it nearly impossible to finance budget deficits, pay for essential imports, or support the country's fragile banking system. The loss of credit lines also meant that any attempt to stabilize the currency or rebuild reserves was stymied from the outset. As a result, the state's fiscal position deteriorated even further, deepening the spiral of crisis. International donors also reassessed their engagement, while some forms of humanitarian aid continued, especially food relief during periods of acute shortage. Many development and agricultural support programs were suspended or withdrawn. The government's frequent politicization of aid, channeling support to loyalists or delaying distribution, meant that even when help arrived, it was often inconsistent and subject to manipulation. For many Zimbabweans, especially those in rural areas dependent on outside support, this withdrawal had immediate effects on daily survival. The government's response to growing isolation was to double down on a narrative of external blame. Officials insisted that sanctions and what they described as economic warfare by Western countries were the root cause of Zimbabwe's troubles. This message dominated state media and was repeated in speeches and official statements. By framing the crisis as a result of foreign interference, the government sought to deflect attention from domestic policy failures, such as unchecked money printing, corruption, and the collapse of commercial agriculture. The rhetoric also aimed to rally support by invoking memories of colonialism and the liberation struggle, presenting the sanctions as a new form of external domination. Yet, the reality was far more complex. Sanctions certainly made it harder for Zimbabwe to access credit, attract investment, or participate in global financial markets. However, they did not create the underlying problems of hyperinflation, institutional decay, or the breakdown of the agricultural sector. These issues had roots in domestic decisions and mismanagement. The effect of sanctions was to magnify the impact of these choices, accelerating the decline and making recovery more difficult. The government's inability to secure substantial alternative investment from neighboring countries or new partners like China further underscored how deep the isolation had become. Ordinary Zimbabweans felt the consequences of this isolation in tangible ways. Foreign currency reserves dwindled as export revenues from agriculture and mining collapsed. With little access to new credit or investment, the country struggled to pay for imports. Essential goods that could not be produced locally, fuel, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, became scarce and prohibitively expensive. Hospitals reported shortages of basic supplies, and power outages became common as the government could not afford to maintain infrastructure or import energy. The squeeze on foreign exchange also meant that businesses had to turn to the black market for dollars, further driving up prices and fueling inflation. The private sector, once a source of growth and employment, contracted rapidly. Factories closed and unemployment soared. Skilled professionals left the country in large numbers, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Those who remained navigated a landscape shaped by scarcity, informal trading, and constant uncertainty. Remittances from the diaspora became a lifeline for many families, providing a crucial source of hard currency that helped cushion the worst effects of the crisis. However, these inflows could not compensate for the broader collapse of formal economic structures. Humanitarian aid, though present, was often delayed or entangled in political disputes. International organizations faced challenges in delivering assistance, sometimes encountering bureaucratic hurdles or outright obstruction from state authorities. Aid was sometimes distributed along political lines, with access tied to party loyalty or withheld from communities seen as unsupportive of the government. This further eroded trust in public institutions and deepened divisions within society. As the crisis dragged on, the government's search for new partners led to the Look East policy, an effort to cultivate relationships with countries like China and Russia. Some investment deals materialized, especially in mining and construction, but they were not enough to offset the effects of Western isolation and the collapse of domestic industries. The scale of Zimbabwe's economic challenges required more than isolated projects or short-term credit lines. Without broad-based investment and a return to international financial markets, recovery remained elusive. By the mid-2000s, Zimbabwe's situation had become critical. Hyperinflation reached levels rarely seen in history. Investment had vanished, and millions of people had left the country in search of work and stability. The banking system was in disarray, and the Zimbabwean dollar had lost all credibility. The government's options narrowed further as foreign reserves ran out, and the ability to import even basic necessities became compromised. In this environment, remittances from abroad became the main source of foreign exchange, but they could not reverse the broader economic collapse. The mounting pressures forced the government to make a drastic decision. In 2009, with the Zimbabwean dollar essentially worthless and hyperinflation still spiraling, officials abandoned the national currency. The country adopted a multi-currency system, allowing the use of the US dollar, South African rand, and other foreign currencies for all transactions. This move, known as dollarization, brought immediate relief from the worst effects of inflation. Prices stabilized, and the economy found a measure of predictability that had been absent for years. Dollarization was not a panacea. It ended the chaos of hyperinflation but left Zimbabwe without control over its own monetary policy. The country now depended on the availability of foreign cash, which it could not print or regulate. While this shift restored some stability and allowed for the resumption of basic economic activity, it also introduced new challenges and trade-offs that would shape the next phase of Zimbabwe's recovery. The experience of sanctions and isolation revealed the complex interplay between external pressures and domestic decisions. While international measures restricted access to credit and investment, it was ultimately the combination of those pressures with internal mismanagement that brought Zimbabwe's economy to the brink. The decision to abandon the national currency marked a turning point, forcing Zimbabweans to adapt once again to a new reality shaped by forces both within and beyond their borders. When a nation's money fails so completely that it must be abandoned, the question becomes, what happens next? The story of Zimbabwe's dollarization offers a window into the difficult choices and lasting consequences that follow such a dramatic step. In 2009, Zimbabwe's government took the extraordinary step of abandoning its own currency and adopting a multi-currency system. This shift, known as dollarization, meant that the US dollar, South African rand, and even the euro became legal tender for everyday transactions. The move was not a sign of economic strength or confidence. It was a last resort, a direct response to the devastation wrought by years of hyperinflation and the collapse of public trust in the Zimbabwean dollar. For most citizens, this transition was abrupt, but it offered a potential escape from a cycle that had become unsustainable. Dollarization arrived at a time when the economy had ground to a halt. Hyperinflation had rendered the local currency nearly worthless. Prices doubled almost daily, and the largest Zimbabwean dollar notes, some in the trillions, couldn't buy a week's groceries. The banking system was paralyzed. People's savings had evaporated, and businesses struggled to operate in an environment where the value of money changed by the hour. By adopting foreign currencies, Zimbabwe's leaders aimed to restore confidence and bring stability to a system that had lost all credibility. The effects of this decision were immediate and dramatic. Hyperinflation, which had dominated every aspect of economic life, ended almost overnight. Prices stabilized, and the relentless upward spiral that had characterized daily transactions came to a halt. For the first time in years, Zimbabweans could plan for the future without fearing that their money would lose value between morning and evening. Shops began to restock, and the basic rhythms of commerce returned. Businesses, relieved from the chaos of constantly shifting prices, could once again set wages and manage inventories with some degree of certainty. Daily life changed in visible ways. Gone were the days of carrying bags or wheelbarrows of near worthless notes. The US dollar and South African rand held their value, allowing people to make purchases with confidence. Farmers could sell their crops knowing that their earnings would not vanish overnight, and workers could accept salaries that meant something in real terms. The psychological relief was significant. After years of uncertainty, Zimbabweans could finally trust that the money in their hands would still be worth something the next day. Yet, this newfound stability came with profound trade-offs. By adopting foreign currencies, Zimbabwe gave up its monetary sovereignty. The country no longer had control over its own currency or the ability to set independent monetary policy. Decisions about interest rates, money supply, and inflation were now effectively made in Washington, Pretoria, or Brussels, far removed from Zimbabwe's unique economic circumstances. If the U.S. Federal Reserve adjusted policy, Zimbabwe felt the effects, but had no say in the matter. This loss of autonomy left the government unable to respond flexibly to new economic shocks or tailor policies to local needs. One of the most immediate challenges was liquidity. Without the ability to print its own money, Zimbabwe depended entirely on the physical inflow of foreign cash. US dollars and other currencies had to be earned through exports, foreign investment, or remittances from Zimbabweans living abroad. However, the country's export sector was still weak, and foreign investment remained limited. As a result, banks often ran short of cash. Long lines reappeared at ATMs, this time for US dollars or rand, and withdrawals were often rationed. Businesses struggled to access enough currency to pay suppliers and workers, and the shortage of small change sometimes forced shopkeepers to offer candy or pens as substitutes for coins. This scarcity of foreign cash exposed deeper inequalities. Access to US dollars was not distributed evenly. Those with connections to the business sector, government, or the diaspora often had more reliable sources of hard currency. In contrast, many ordinary Zimbabweans, especially those in rural areas, continue to rely on bartering or on remittances sent by relatives working abroad. The divide between those who could participate in the formal, dollarized economy and those left on the margins grew more pronounced, creating new social and economic tensions. Another significant consequence was the loss of seigniorage, the profit a government earns by printing money and issuing it at face value. During the hyperinflation years, the Zimbabwean government had relied on seigniorage to finance its operations, often at the expense of economic stability. With dollarization, this source of revenue vanished. The government could no longer generate funds by issuing its own currency, and had to depend instead on tax collection and foreign aid. This loss put additional strain on an already stretched public sector, making it harder to fund basic services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The logistical aspects of dollarization were also complex. Zimbabwe needed a steady supply of foreign currency to keep the economy running, but with exports and investment still depressed, the main source of dollars became remittances from the diaspora. Millions of Zimbabweans living abroad sent money home, supporting families and injecting much-needed liquidity into local markets. While these remittances helped many households survive, they could not substitute for a robust, self-sustaining economy. The country remained vulnerable to fluctuations in global remittance flows, and reliance on external support highlighted the fragility of the recovery. Dollarization brought stability, but it did not address the underlying causes of Zimbabwe's economic crisis. The fundamental issues, disrupted agricultural production, persistent corruption, and weak governance, remained unresolved. While prices stopped spiraling out of control, the broader economy continued to struggle. Industries that depended on capital investment, such as manufacturing and mining, found it difficult to expand in an environment where cash was scarce and credit was limited. The lack of monetary policy tools meant that the government could not stimulate growth or cushion the economy during downturns. For many Zimbabweans, the experience of dollarization was a mixture of relief and frustration. The end of hyperinflation brought a sense of normalcy, but the challenges of daily life persisted. Unemployment remained high, and poverty was widespread. The promise of stability did not translate into prosperity for most families. Instead, people adapted to a new reality in which access to foreign currency determined their ability to participate in the economy. The memory of the Zimbabwean dollar's collapse lingered, making many wary of any proposals to reintroduce a local currency. The government occasionally floated the idea of bringing back the Zimbabwean dollar, but public trust was slow to return. The scars of hyperinflation ran deep, and few believed that the underlying problems had been fixed. Most citizens preferred the predictability of the US dollar or rand, even if it meant giving up some measure of national control. The experience underscored how difficult it is to rebuild confidence once it has been lost, and how closely economic stability is tied to trust in institutions. Dollarization's impact extended beyond the economy. It changed how Zimbabweans viewed their government, their financial system, and their place in the world. Abandoning the national currency was not just a technical adjustment, it was a recognition of failure and a signal that the country had reached a point where only drastic measures could restore order. The transition forced people to rethink their relationship with money and with the state, shaping attitudes toward risk, savings, and the future. Over time, the limits of dollarization became more apparent. While it ended the immediate crisis of hyperinflation, it left Zimbabwe exposed to new risks. The country remained dependent on external sources of currency and investment, with little ability to influence broader economic conditions. The loss of seigniorage revenue made it harder for the government to provide services, and persistent liquidity shortages kept the economy fragile. The underlying structural issues that had led to the crisis in the first place were still present, waiting to be addressed. Despite these challenges, the adoption of foreign currencies marked a turning point. It showed that even in the face of extreme economic collapse, decisive action could restore a measure of stability. The experience also highlighted the resilience and adaptability of ordinary Zimbabweans, who found ways to navigate a constantly shifting landscape. As the country moved forward, it became clear that the lessons learned from this period would shape how people approach the future. What unfolded in Zimbabwe after dollarization was not just a story of policy and economics, but a testament to the capacity of individuals and communities to adapt when faced with extraordinary adversity. The ways in which people responded to the crisis, through innovation, cooperation, and determination, offer important insights into what it takes to survive when the foundations of daily life are shaken. The story of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is ultimately about more than economic collapse. It is a study in resilience and fragility, revealing how a society responds when the basic foundations of daily life are upended. As formal institutions faltered, ordinary Zimbabweans faced a world where the rules of commerce and trust in money were rewritten almost overnight. Everyday survival depended not on official systems, but on adaptability and creative problem-solving. Two of the most striking examples of this resilience were the rise of barter networks and the adoption of mobile payments. When the Zimbabwean dollar lost all practical value, people quickly reverted to direct exchange. Barter markets became hubs of activity, where goods and services were swapped without the need for cash. A teacher might exchange a basket of vegetables for a few liters of fuel, or a mechanic might repair a generator in return for maize meal. These arrangements were often inefficient and unpredictable, but they allowed families to meet their immediate needs when formal markets and banking systems failed. The barter system's growth underscored not just resourcefulness, but also the importance of community ties and trust among neighbors. At the same time, the collapse of the banking sector forced innovation in financial transactions. With only about 6.5 ATMs per 100,000 people and cash in short supply, Zimbabweans turned to digital alternatives. The adoption of mobile payment platforms like EcoCash transformed how people conducted business. By 2017, mobile money accounted for nearly 90% of all transactions in the country. This shift was not simply a matter of convenience, it was a necessity. EcoCash and similar services allowed users to send and receive payments, purchase goods, and pay bills using mobile phones, bypassing the need for physical cash or functioning banks. In a country where traditional financial infrastructure had collapsed, digital payments offered a critical lifeline, keeping commerce alive and providing a measure of stability. These adaptations, however, were not available to everyone. Access to mobile phones, reliable networks, and digital literacy varied widely, particularly between urban and rural areas. For those without these resources, survival often depended on informal barter or access to foreign currency, factors that deepened existing inequalities. Remittances from family members abroad became another crucial support, especially for those who could not participate in the new digital economy. This dual reality created a society where resilience was celebrated, but the uneven distribution of coping mechanisms also left many vulnerable. The fragility of Zimbabwe's economic system was laid bare as trust in institutions evaporated with remarkable speed. Banks, once seen as protectors of savings and pillars of stability, quickly became sources of frustration and even despair. Withdrawal limits, empty ATMs, and the rapid devaluation of deposits turned the act of banking into a daily ordeal. People who had spent years building up savings watched their life's work vanish almost overnight. The sense of betrayal ran deep, and the erosion of trust extended beyond the financial sector to the very core of government and public life. This rapid collapse of confidence underscores a critical lesson. Economic stability is built on trust, and once that trust is broken, it is extraordinarily difficult to restore. Zimbabwe's experience shows how fragile even the most established systems can be when sound fiscal management and credible institutions are absent. The government's decision to print money to cover deficits, combined with unchecked spending and politically motivated policies, triggered a downward spiral that no technical fix could easily reverse. The consequences were not just economic, they were social and psychological, leaving scars that would take years to heal. The crisis in Zimbabwe also highlights the dangers of politicized economic decisions. When leaders prioritize short-term political gain over long-term fiscal responsibility, the results can be catastrophic. The use of monetary policy as a tool for consolidating power, rather than maintaining stability, led directly to the loss of public confidence and the collapse of the currency. This cautionary tale serves as a warning to other nations. Responsible governance and transparent financial management are not optional. They are essential to maintaining the foundations of any economy. For global observers, Zimbabwe's hyperinflation offers valuable insights into the mechanics of economic collapse and recovery. It demonstrates that recovery is not simply a matter of introducing new notes or adopting foreign currencies. True stabilization requires rebuilding institutions, restoring credibility, and addressing the structural problems that caused the crisis in the first place. Without these deeper reforms, any return to normalcy will be fragile at best. The long process of regaining trust in the financial system, re-establishing the rule of law, and fostering a culture of accountability is as important as any technical solution. The human cost of Zimbabwe's crisis cannot be overstated. Hyperinflation wiped out savings, pensions, and the hopes of an entire generation. Professionals who had dedicated their lives to careers in education, healthcare, or engineering found themselves starting over as street vendors or informal traders. Families were separated as millions emigrated in search of stability, and communities were fractured under the strain of daily survival. Even those who managed to adapt carried the burden of lost opportunities and diminished expectations for the future. Yet, the story is not solely one of loss. The ability of Zimbabweans to adapt, whether through barter, digital payments, or community cooperation, reveals a remarkable capacity for ingenuity under pressure. Small acts of solidarity, from sharing food to pooling resources for school fees, played a vital role in helping families weather the storm. The widespread adoption of mobile money, despite the challenges, stands as a testament to the power of innovation in overcoming institutional failure. These responses show that even when systems break down, people find ways to support each other and keep society functioning. Still, resilience should not be mistaken for a solution to systemic failure. The need for such extraordinary adaptation is itself a sign of how deeply the crisis affected every aspect of life. The scars left by hyperinflation, lost savings, broken trust, and disrupted communities remain long after the currency stabilized. For many, the memory of waiting in line at banks, watching salaries lose value by the hour, or relying on barter for daily needs is a reminder of how quickly stability can disappear. Zimbabwe's experience serves as both a warning and an inspiration. It shows the profound impact of broken institutions and poor policy choices, but also the strength of individuals and communities in the face of adversity. The lessons go beyond economics, touching on the importance of credible leadership, the dangers of unchecked power, and the central role of trust in maintaining social order. The crisis demonstrates how easily trust can be lost, and how painstaking the process of rebuilding it can be. As we reflect on Zimbabwe's story, it becomes clear that the balance between resilience and fragility is delicate. The ability of people to adapt is impressive, but it is no substitute for sound governance and reliable institutions. The crisis reminds us that economic systems are only as strong as the trust that underpins them, and that once that trust is gone, recovery is a long and uncertain road. These lessons about trust, governance, and human ingenuity resonate far beyond Zimbabwe's borders. Looking at Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis, two themes stand out: the necessity of credible monetary policy and the resilience of communities under pressure. When sound fiscal management is abandoned, even the most stable systems can unravel, with devastating effects on ordinary lives. Money loses its meaning, and daily routines are upended. Yet, amid these hardships, people found ways to adapt and survive. This balance between policy failure and human resilience is at the heart of Zimbabwe's story. What steps can citizens and policymakers take today to safeguard against similar collapse? Share your thoughts in the comments on how institutions can maintain public trust. If you value economic stability and want to understand how policy shapes lives, subscribe for more deep dives.